I now have the rare opportunity of introducing Kathleen O'Toole. She not only has decades of experience on the law enforcement front from a large city perspective, from a national perspective, but from an international perspective. We know of her from Boston, from Seattle, from so many different agencies. She has supported what have been engagements that are associated with the private sector, with the public sector, with the federal government, with academic institutions. She has done extreme work on the international side, and she'll be sharing those experiences with us. And at the heart of it, she is a passionate, inspirational voice that truly, if you aren't interested in this topic at this moment, you will definitely be interested before the end of the session. And I am very pleased to pass the podium to Kathleen. And Kathleen, I know the next session, as we've made reference to, is definitely going to be in person. But we figured if we could do the pandemic this way, we could definitely get a great resource this way and provide you all the connection to what is going to be a great discussion. So Kathleen, I'm going to hand it over to you and ask you to just give a little bit of a brief background on yourself for the one or two individuals that have been living in a different world and don't know who you are, and then ask you to give us your perspectives on reform. If and when we get to the point of needing to sort of spark discussion, there are certain topics that we've chatted about, but know that I know you don't need a lot of juice to get this going, so have at it.
Thanks very much, Maria. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I so regret that I'm not there in person to see you and to see so many of my other friends that I know are in attendance there. Happily, I am the proud grandmother for the first time of a recent arrival, my granddaughter Madeline. So that's one of the reasons I couldn't travel there in person. And then my husband's been experiencing some medical challenges. So but I promise, and I hope to be there in person for the next convening. So thanks very much for including me and for accommodating me to participate remotely. Yeah, I mean, when you read my bio or you talk about my experience, I kind of chuckle because I never even imagined I'd be a police officer, never mind have all these unique opportunities over the course of many years. I originally took the police job on a dare when I was in law school. My law school pals dared me to take the job when it was offered. And I thought I'd do it for a year or two, see the law from a different perspective. And, here I am decades later. So I feel so blessed that I found my true vocation. It wasn't long, out there on the front lines in the street in Boston, it was exhilarating to fight crime and to make arrests and to chase cars and do all of those law enforcement things. But I also discovered that policing is much more about providing service to vulnerable people. And I know I'm preaching to the believers when I say that to this audience. I think that we do a horrible job of telling our own story, but I'll elaborate on that a bit later. I had the opportunity to travel to different corners of the world and to work on both coasts here in the United States. And each jurisdiction certainly has its unique characteristics. Each community has different desires for its police, and community safety. I like to refer to it as community safety is a priority for all. But each jurisdiction is very, very unique. Yet the principles of democratic policing are common to every place. I remember arriving in Ireland, and I was appointed as chief inspector of the Garda Síochána inspectorate in Ireland. And the media showed up for day one for the announcement, and they said, "Oh yeah, you're from America. You'll probably make the recommendation that we arm all of our police." And I just chuckled and I said, "Hey, I really respect the fact that the police service here has been a routinely unarmed police service, and long may that last. I'm concerned about the safety, the well-being of officers in an environment that's becoming more routinely dangerous. But at the same time, I think there are measures we could put into place while still preserving that tradition in Ireland, which we did." So I remember going to Seattle And they said, well, what's your community policing strategy? Are you going to implement the same strategy you implemented in Boston? And I said, no. And furthermore, I'm not dictating the community policing strategy. That should be determined by police on the front lines and people working and living in the communities. That needs to be a grassroots approach. So again, every jurisdiction has its unique characteristics, and we need to honor that and we need to respect that. But at the same time, we can apply the same principles across the board. And I found that many things work. One of the most incredible experiences I had was working on the peace process in Northern Ireland. And most of you know that was a highly divided society. They'd been through 30 years of war. I mean, it was really, really contentious environment. And policing was one of the real hot button issues. In fact, it was one of the issues that Senator Mitchell and his team were unable to resolve. So they created a separate commission to address the policing issue. And I was asked to serve as one of 8 members of that commission. And we crisscrossed Northern Ireland. We spent countless hours in community meetings. We spent lots of time in private meetings with victims, survivors. We spent lots of time with police out on the front lines, and we listened carefully to everybody's perspectives. And at the end of the day, we knew that we weren't going to come up with a plan that would keep everybody happy. That wasn't the goal. Our chair, Chris Patten, the last British governor of Hong Kong, who then went to Northern Ireland to chair this process, said, at the end of the day, we're not going to keep everybody happy. Let's just go where the truth takes us. And boy, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've relied on that statement. Gather the data, gather timely and accurate data, both qualitative and quantitative, and base decisions, base your strategies on that information. And that's precisely what we did in Northern Ireland. And we created a model, a blueprint for a new policing service there. But coincidentally, we didn't expect it at the time. It became a model that people used in many jurisdictions throughout the world going forward, because again, the basic principles of democratic policing were the foundation for our work there. So I'll just cover on a few topics. And Maria, please don't hesitate to interrupt me, to ask questions. I really want this to be an interactive session. But I'll start first with leadership, because I think that's really where it all begins. And I've also said it's not about one person. I've led large organizations. In addition to being the chief in Boston and Seattle, I was also the secretary of public safety in Massachusetts, where I had responsibility for 20 agencies. It's not about one person. One person can't accomplish, an effective management operation, especially in a large organization. And I've relied really heavily on my teams. And I've been able to establish some phenomenal teams in different places where I've worked. But leadership really does set the tone. And people talk about, police culture, and it's impossible to shift organizational culture. That has not been my experience. I think a strong leadership team, especially in a crisis situation, has the ability to drive cultural change fairly quickly. And I've seen it happen in different organizations. And, police leadership, I think we've always tended to be, that's the military model. It's the chain of command. It's mostly the sworn with occasional civilians helping us out. But I've tried to create a different paradigm in my teams, and I'll use Seattle as an example. When I arrived in Seattle, there were some very capable and very dedicated sworn police officers who were working on the command team there. And I respected them and I appreciated the effort they put into their work, but I knew that we needed more diversity. And I'm not just talking about diversity in terms of gender and race and ethnicity. I'm talking about diversity of thought as well. So we proceeded to do nationwide search and come up with a very, very diverse command team. When I arrived, there were about a dozen people on the command team, and they were all sworn people, probably of my generation, with a similar trajectory through career policing. And by the time I left, there were 12 people on my team, but among us, we were half sworn, half non-sworn. We had 4 JDs, 4 PhDs, a former Boeing engineer. We had a very, very diverse team, and we had some really spirited discussions about where we were taking the organization and what our priorities would be. But we did it in a cohesive and respectful way. And we had people who'd never spent any time in policing. And boy, they brought some of the best perspectives to the table because they questioned us. They said, well, why are we doing it this way? And they came up with unique ideas. So I really want to underscore, before we talk about anything else, if you really want to drive organizational excellence, if you really want to drive reform in policing that's desperately needed in many jurisdictions today, it really starts with that leadership team. And that leadership and the leader, the chief or the CEO, really needs to empower those people, really needs to delegate authority to capable people. I use the Seattle example, but when I was in Boston, I had a similar experience. We come up through the ranks as good cops and good detectives, but what prepares us to manage huge organizations with thousands of personnel and millions, if not billions, of operating dollars? Not much. We don't have a lot of continuing professional development, unfortunately, in policing. So we need to tap other resources. And I remember when I was in Boston, I was introduced to a guy who was formerly worked in the investment community. It was a very senior manager in a national investment firm. And he had retired when he was in his 40s with probably more money than he could ever spend. And we were talking about my challenges in the police department and how I really needed to bring in somebody with sound experience, with business acumen, with management experience. And he was so intrigued by it. By the conversation, I sensed that. And I said to him, I know this is a ridiculous question, but would you ever consider making a commitment for a few years to the Boston Police Department? And he said, well, only if I could do it for nothing. And I said, no, if I don't pay you, nobody will take you seriously. And so we came to an agreement. He came on board, and he was, without a doubt, one of my very closest allies, confidants, and worked. He was the first one in the office in the morning and was always walking out with me at the end of the day. And again, he was somebody who had no experience in policing, but had great respect for the police and brought a really fresh perspective to the table. Similarly, I know there are a lot of people who are committed to technology in the audience there, and I absolutely believe that it's so important to have our technology leaders at the table, a part of our team, part of our command team. When I was Secretary of Public Safety in Massachusetts, I started that trend. I always had my Chief Information Officer sitting at my right hand. So as we contemplated some of our challenges and developed some of our strategies, that person was there to help develop the technology tools to support us. I've always said technology should be the tool, not the driver. Bad business practice is a bad business practice, whether it's automated or not. But once we decided on our strategy, once we developed our business practices, my friend Craig was right there to help us develop solutions, technology solutions that would enhance efficiency, enhance effectiveness. So I became a real passionate advocate for technology and public safety as well. But again, that diverse command team that brings several different perspectives to the table, I mean, that's really what I've seen work in my experience. And then the next thing I really want to focus on is community. And again, a lot of community policing, I think, is that word, that phrase that we use so liberally, but I've seldom seen it defined in many jurisdictions. And I think it's really, really important that that be defined on the local level. And community policing for me is not an assignment. It's not a unit. It's the foundation. It's the ethos on which the whole organization should be built. And we need to really honor our community. I mean, the days of going out and the police standing up front behind a podium and speaking to the community and reporting out to the community without any authentic engagement, it's very ineffective. I think we really need to engage authentically with our communities. And that starts again at the top. I think police leaders need to model that behavior and then encourage it all the way down through the ranks, and most importantly, with frontline police officers. So I'll just speak a little bit about our micro community policing plans in Seattle. Again, when I arrived there, well, what's your strategy? I said, it's not going to be my strategy. It's going to be our strategy. And it's going to be our strategy after some robust and authentic community engagement. Seattle was a city of proud neighborhoods. In some respects, it reminded me of Boston. Everybody, when you say, where are you from in Boston, people don't, where are you from? People don't say Boston. They say Southie, they say Dorchester, they say Charlestown, they say Roxbury. People take pride in their individual neighborhoods. And Seattle had a similar vibe. People were really proud of their individual neighborhoods. So we respected that, and we redrew many of our reporting lines and our district boundaries around to align with some of these neighborhood boundaries as well. And we divided the city into dozens of neighborhoods that people really related to. And we went out with the help of Seattle University, a phenomenal academic partner. Seattle University helped us develop the strategy and also helped us develop metrics to measure our results. And we went out to communities, and we had frontline police officers involved in this effort. And we had discussions. We said, look, we're always going to respond to 911 calls. I mean, that's a no-brainer. We're always going to respond to serious crime. But what are the top 3 to 5 things in your neighborhood that you want the police to respond to, that you want to work with us collaboratively on? How are we going to harness resources? How are we going to work in multidisciplinary approaches to tackle these issues that are really important to this neighborhood? And we developed those 3 to 5 priorities. And when we weren't racing to the next 911 call, or we weren't dealing with a serious felony violation, we were focusing on those 3 to 5 priorities in those neighborhoods. And again, Seattle University went out, analyzed the results, did community surveys, and really, really helped us. I'm so proud of those micro community policing plans. And I really do think it's an indication that even in a big city, even in a large world-class city, everything is local, right? The famous Massachusetts politician and Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, said all politics is local. Well, all policing is as well. And I think even in large cities, we have to start with a grassroots approach to developing our community policing strategies. I know everybody's challenged right now with recruitment and retention. And I think there's a huge opportunity there. Again, I'll actually build on the Seattle story I just told. With Seattle University students, we actually had several graduate students and some seniors come in, and they actually facilitated these meetings at the neighborhood level. And they got to see policing firsthand. They got to know officers. They got to engage with the community. They got to help develop strategies. They got to capture data and analyze data and help us tell our story. The vast majority of those students that worked on that project ended up eventually coming to the police department to work, either in sworn or civilian capacities. because they established that relationship, they got a better sense for it. So I think it's really essential. And in Boston and Seattle, we had great academic resources. I would absolutely encourage everyone, if you haven't already, to really establish those robust relationships with academic partners and have them sitting at your table, embedded in your organization, whether they're professors, highly skilled academics, or whether they're graduate students or mature students, because it really does give you an opportunity to not only leverage their resources, but in the case of students, to encourage future employment with the organization. I was also the chair of Law Enforcement Exploring for nationally for several years. And in Seattle, we had an outstanding exploring program where young people between the ages of 14 and 21 came into our organization, learned about policing, learned what it was really about, not just what they saw on television, and really got a sense for it. And again, the majority of those young people eventually pursued a career in policing. And if they didn't, they had a new understanding and respect for policing, and they were a real bridge to our communities. The majority of the exploring law enforcement explorers in Seattle were kids from underserved communities. And I gave them so much credit and the courage they had to put on a uniform and come with us to community events and help facilitate events. And whether we were doing summer picnics or school events, those kids were phenomenal. And they really provided a bridge for us to their communities. So I'm all for any type of cadet program, exploring program, academic partnerships to really bring young people into policing so they get a firsthand view of it. And finally, when it comes to recruiting, I think that, this applies across the board in terms of community trust, recruitment, but I absolutely think we need to do a much better job of telling our own story. In policing, the vast majority of people out there, whether we want to believe it or not, watch television and think policing is all about the gunfights and the car chases and the law enforcement, the arrests. And most of you know, as I do, that that's such a small percentage of what police actually do. And in fact, I've seen recent studies that underscore this, that only 4 to 5% of policing in most of our major cities across the country focuses on violent crime, and that less than 15% of policing focuses on law enforcement, which means that the vast majority of our work is providing service to people in need, and often very vulnerable people. So when I went out to Seattle, it really struck me. I said, it's a relatively safe city compared to a lot of major cities. We were barely tracking crime. We were doing enough to report our Part 1 crime to the federal government, and that was about it. So we immediately instituted kind of a very elementary version of CompStat. We called it CStat, but we started within a couple months of my arrival. I said, we have to start capturing more timely and accurate data, and we'll start with crime data. But it became apparent to me, again, in Seattle, that was only a fraction of the work we were doing, that most of our challenges were really at the intersection of public health and public safety. We had so many people on the streets experiencing homelessness. We had lots of people with addiction conditions. We had people in mental health crisis we were responding to day after day after day. And I said, are we capturing any of this data? I mean, does our community have a clue that we're doing all of this work? So again, worked very closely with our analysts, with our tech staff, and said, how are we going to capture more timely and accurate data? We purchased a new RMS system. We established, we integrated a lot of our data. We had to cleanse a lot of our old data. And it was just an incredible experience. I mean, once we captured this data and to get a better sense for what our police were actually doing, we determined that Seattle cops were responding to people in mental health crisis 10,000 times a year, serious mental health crisis. Even as the chief, I had a sense we were doing a lot of that work, but I was stunned to learn that we were doing that much of the work. And we were able to determine that, initially I said, well, why don't we hand that off to people more that are better prepared to handle that work? But we were able to determine through accurate and timely data that in 50% of these cases, the individuals were threatening either themselves or others. And in nearly 10% of the cases, the individuals were armed. That's a really powerful story that we needed to tell our community. And we didn't even have the data prior to this. And that once we were able to capture it, we were not only able to use it to operate more effectively in our organization, but we were able to share it with other multidisciplinary partners. And most importantly, we were able to share it with our community. So they had a much better sense for what our officers were doing. So I'm passionate, I've had the opportunity to weave in and out of policing. I worked in the tech industry for a little while, developed a real appreciation for what timely and accurate data can do to help inform our operations, all operations, not just our crime fighting, but all operations. And most importantly, to be transparent and to inform our community. And, I've always said, I learned from some of my phenomenal mentors, again, go where the truth takes you. Even if the data is somewhat embarrassing or concerning, put it out there, stand up, tell the truth, take responsibility for it, and then work with the community to address, some of the concerns that may evolve. But in most instances, I found that the data ended up being very flattering to the police department. Showed that we only used force in a fraction of 1% of interactions with community members. So, it was always my inclination, let's develop public-facing dashboards, get the information out there, not just crime data, use of force data relative to dealing with people in mental health crisis. I mean, sometimes you have to anonymize this stuff, but you all know that capturing accurate and timely data is not only advantageous for the police service, it's really advantageous to the community as well, because the community will have a better sense for what the police service is doing, and also will be more inclined to engage in discussions about where to address some of the challenges. I don't want to ramble on too much here. Why don't I just take a quick break and ask Maria if there are any other priorities she'd like me to touch on here. Certainly we can talk more about community, we can talk more about accountability in policing, but I just want to take a quick break and see if Maria or others in the audience have any questions or any particular areas you'd like me to focus on.
Absolutely. Is this working? Yes. First of all, thank you, Kathleen. And I guess so many questions come to mind. And if we were in a room that had a whiteboard, I would try to figure this out from what needs to be running simultaneously. But I know that what you've shared with us today and the conversations that we've had in the past speak to what are then not only jurisdictional responses, but then, as you make reference to, community flavors, right? Get to know those individuals in those areas that then need responses, and most importantly, need those relationships built one-on-one with you, with the team, with the agency, so that they are then re-educated. On the one hand, the community relationship perspective, the notion of the culture is by default and by behavior. And then even your reference to recruitment and retention are all issues related to what is happening within the agency. As we deal with and as we speak to reform nationally, and I won't even go to the international level just yet, but as we speak to reform nationally, how do we propose or how do we support change that then teaches these concepts for the nationwide agencies, right? And I speak to the how do we speak and how do we teach the leaders, realizing that in the new world, if we were starting this concept, we would say that we want all new leaders or anybody that's going to be a deputy chief or above, or even a captain or above, has to go through some formal training that is going to teach them these various concepts that they're going to need to do their own assessments when they get to those levels. But right now, we're going into it when we are in the midst of defunding in certain agencies, of political strife in certain agencies, of certainly resource issues, whether it's they're losing it or they don't know how to be able to recoup it because of lack of funding. How do we address sort of the crisis going on while we then are acting and creating relationships with a specific community, right? We've got a national issue and then we've got a regional issue. How do we address those simultaneously?
Well, I mean, there's so many different answers to that one question,
I
but
know it's a
I
long
would say
question because there's a lot of facets that I was thinking of simultaneously.
no, it's really good. It's really good. It's very thought provoking. I would say that there certainly is a crisis of confidence now, and I've been around long enough. I mean, from Rodney King to all these other tragedies that have occurred from time to time in policing, and when public confidence has really been shaken. And we can't start to establish relationships then. And as we've discovered, it's not just what happens in your own police agency, especially today with media, social media. One incident in a different corner of the country can have massive effect on a police agency thousands of miles away. We certainly saw that in Seattle, in the aftermath of Ferguson, after the murder of George Floyd. I mean, we've seen it in cities throughout the country. The community confidence has really been shaken in policing. So it's really up to us to rebuild and to work. And it requires that authentic engagement. And I always try to build those relationships and maintain those relationships during the good times to the greatest extent possible. So when there is a crisis, I can turn to those trusted community partners and I can rely on them to engage in honest dialogue with me. I'll give you an example. I think the clergy, whether in Boston or Seattle or in Northern Ireland, I've had incredible success and relationships, really, relationships that I truly value with clergy members and diverse clergy members representing very different perspectives. But I'd say in Boston and Seattle, I must have had dozens of clergy members on speed dial. And if we had a really high profile or questionable incident, I started right away personally dialing those numbers and saying, can't talk for long. This is what we've got. This just happened. I want you to be aware of it before you hear it in the news. I don't have all the facts. The facts are likely to change as the investigation unfolds, but I promise to keep you updated. And people were so appreciative that they were hearing that from me or from a senior member of my team and not hearing it, on the evening news or getting it, through some type of social media post. So, I think that those friendships, those authentic friendships that are I mean, that was my favorite part of the job, engaging with people, not just people in need, providing service to people in need, but engaging with people who wanted to have constructive dialogue. I can remember during really, really difficult times, I was invited to go to churches and I would actually be asked to go up to the, and believe me, I don't claim to have a halo over my head. I always joke about being a situational Catholic. I call on the saints when all hell breaks loose, but I spent more time in churches as a police leader than I ever did earlier in my life. So, and being able to speak to people and have the clergy help facilitate that dialogue and build that bridge was incredibly helpful. And another thing I just want to touch on, Maria, is the power of multidisciplinary approaches. Now, and this is hard. It's hard work to get people together. And sometimes the police, because we're accustomed to taking charge and we're good organizers, sometimes we have to start, we have to develop the framework for this. But whether in Boston, working as a Massachusetts Secretary of Public Safety, or in Seattle, we can't solve these problems ourselves. A lot of these problems are really, really complicated, whether we're talking about youth violence, domestic violence, mental health crisis, homelessness. The police are not going to resolve these problems alone, but we're going to get the 911 calls day in and day out to respond to them. So the most successful undertakings I've seen are those where you engage with multidisciplinary partners. When we were fighting gang violence in Boston, we had the clergy, we had education, we had family services, health services, mental health services, we had juvenile justice people. We had everybody at the table, and we're using, again, timely and accurate data to focus on the individuals that needed the most help. Yeah, I mean, some people need to go to jail. That's clear. And bad actors need to go to jail. But, there were a lot of young people who were, caught up in, again, living in underserved communities, not having opportunities. And we were trying to figure out how we could really focus more effort on prevention and intervention. And working in these multidisciplinary approaches, we had huge results. The city of Boston went from having 154 homicides in the early 1990s to having 31 in the late 90s because the Boston Police Department and all of their partners worked really closely together developing strategies. And academics were a big piece of, brought a lot to the table in that initiative as well. When I was Public Safety Secretary in Massachusetts, we brought everybody together, judges, on the domestic violence issue. We got the governor to actually create a governor's commission on domestic violence. And I was one of the co-chairs, and we had judges, we had mental health professionals, we had advocates, victims advocates, we had everybody at the table. We developed subcommittees, we had action items. I mean, we really took that responsibility seriously, but it was a multidisciplinary approach. And then finally in Seattle, dealing with homelessness, it was the police department that launched the navigation team. And we, again, had homeless advocates, mental health professionals, health professionals, all working in teams, going out to homeless encampments and providing services, trying to intervene, trying to provide services to vulnerable members of our community. And it was very effective. Sadly, in Seattle, because of some of the political turmoil there, they decided to take the police out of the navigation team, which was so ironic because we were the ones who started it in the first place. But I think that was one of those short-sighted knee-jerk reactions. But sadly, there are too many knee-jerk reactions, whether it's defund the police. Some of the slogans, I'm all for slogans, if there's substance behind them. But I think we're paying the price for some of the slogans that emerged in recent years. And but I think that we've seen violent crime increase in many of our communities. We've seen quality of life decrease over the last few years. And I think the pendulum is starting to swing back in the right direction, where community members and some elected officials are realizing that it needs to be a thoughtful approach to community safety. I love the term community safety because policing goes well beyond law enforcement, and policing is not something that should be done by the police alone. It needs to be a multidisciplinary, a cohesive and multidisciplinary approach to challenges.
Kathleen, take me to your international experiences. Share with us what you learned from them, and Is the world all going in the same direction, be that good or bad, or are there similarities in the experiences? Are there challenges similar? I mean, I can imagine that the drug issues are similar, the financial challenges are similar. I don't know that they are going through I know some nations are going through some of the same reform issues of one flavor or another. But talk to us about your experiences and where you see either the gap or the similarities that we can learn from.
I really appreciate that question because you just, again, reminded me of another point I wanted to make as follow-up to your last question, Maria. Um, Here in the United States, I really think it's important to touch a bit on training, continuing professional development in policing. Here in the United States, we've made this significant investment in recruit training. We invest most of our money in recruit training and very little, only a fraction of that into in-service and continuing professional development. Speak to my own experience. As I came up to the ranks, if I went once a year and got law updates, went to the range and requalified and got CPR certified every couple of years, that was about the extent of it. And any professional development opportunities I had to seek out and usually pay for myself. So I think we've come a long way. I think IACP offers some good programs. PERF, I'm going to speak tomorrow at the SMIP program. PELI, the Major City Chiefs program. I mean, there are some opportunities out there now, but not nearly enough. And I think the UK provided an incredible example. When I was working in Ireland for 6 years, I was invited to go over each year and speak at the Strategic Command course in the UK. In order to be an assistant chief constable or deputy chief constable or chief constable in the UK, one has to complete the Strategic Command course. And it is absolutely equivalent to an MPA program. In my experience, it's a residential program where people, go and it's not, okay, I know we have like the FBI National Academy, but that's limited to, select people. And, again, I'm not quite sure where the curriculum stands in that program these days, but I can tell you the Strategic Command course curriculum it was developed by academics. It was a very rigorous program, and it gave those who were going to be leaders in policing a really good foundation. As I said before, we come up through the ranks as great cops and great detectives. By the time we're lieutenants, we should know all we need to know about policing. Then we need to focus on leadership and management, and we don't have enough of that focus here. So that's one area where I really think there's room for significant improvement. Even in recruit training in this country, for a long time, I've been advocating for taking as much of the police training out of the traditional police academy. Sure, we need to do all the tactical stuff in the academy environment, and that stuff is necessary, and it should be conducted in the academy environment. But why can't we take a lot of our academic courses into the university environment? Why not partner with universities? Why not sit in classrooms with people who represent other disciplines that we should engage with as we're trying to solve some of the complicated issues in our communities? Why wouldn't we be in classrooms with mental health providers and with homeless advocates and so on? So I just think that there's so much room for improvement in the way we train and educate and continue to develop our personnel, both sworn and non-sworn. So, I think that internationally, I've seen it's a much better job. In the Garda Síochána, you'll be hearing from Assistant Commissioner Shauna Coxon in a bit, and they've done an extraordinary job. They have a 2-year academy, a 2-year residential academy, and they actually graduate from the academy with a degree. It's a partnership with the University of Limerick. So it's a much more robust training and education program. There's a much greater commitment to that than we've made in this country. And you're right, people will say, well, we just don't have the resources. We can't take cops off the street. We can't leave them in the academy that long. Well, guess what? You get what you pay for. And at the end of the day, unless we make that investment, and hopefully, as we see the federal government hopefully support more policing programs, policing reform and modernization programs, hopefully a lot of emphasis will be put on education and training and professional development.
So you've given me two great lead-ins. On the one hand, Shauna is connecting as we speak, so we will engage her shortly, let her introduce herself, and then speak to some of the programs that she is now directly engaged with. But the second one, in the interim, is one of the questions that came to my mind is how do we design and how do we propose and how do we support a national program? And you gave me pieces of it, or at least what I think are going to be part of your response, in order to provide the law enforcement community nationwide the skills or the assets or resources to better training, to better recruitment, to better education, to better policies. And I think the answer is that we need to work with the federal partners. We need to work with the cops of the world, and I say cops as in the community-oriented policing office, the cops office, BJA, et cetera. But give me your thoughts on that, because one of the things that we chatted about yesterday, one of the things that our community does in general is either work with the existing strategies from a national perspective on down and or from a bottom-up perspective within the communities and agencies, or then help develop those over time, right? So this might be one of those development, because obviously this is too huge an issue for any one agency to deal with, any one program to deal with, any one institute to deal with.
Well, and I appreciate that, Maria, and you're absolutely right. And we have 18,000 law enforcement agencies in this country, and lots of them, need reform. And by the way, reform isn't. I've worked on lots of consent decrees. I've worked as a DOJ, an expert to DOJ, assisting them in some of their investigations and implementation processes. I'm currently a monitor in a jurisdiction. I was a monitor previously. And then in Seattle, of course, I was a chief under a consent decree. I think consent decrees, I'm all for them, only because they provide, it really locks the city into a commitment. When the Seattle city government committed to reform the Seattle Police Department, they knew they had to make an investment. We probably never would have been able to buy the equipment and the technology and provide the training and all that was required without that investment. So that sense of urgency does bring opportunity sometimes. But I think that we have a lot of police services in this country who've now been through major reform processes, new policies, new procedures, new training. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. As I said previously, each jurisdiction has its unique characteristics, but at the same time, the principles are common. So we can take a policy from another jurisdiction and we can massage it to fit into our particular jurisdiction. So I think that we can look at some of the best practices that have occurred elsewhere, both within our own country and elsewhere in the world. And without reinventing the wheel, we can adopt those. I've said to DOJ a few times, I would love to create like kind of a catalog of use of force policies, that require de-escalation, that require officer intervention. I mean, there are some principles that are standard, that are common now that we should just make available to other jurisdictions who are just starting on this journey. And the final thing I'll say is that, I think it's really important as we reform our organizations that we embed in those organizations a commitment to ongoing, innovation. We shouldn't have a reform process. It's like ticking boxes saying, okay, we're done now and it's over, because the world's changing at a rapid pace. And our community challenges are going to continue to change. And as police, we should really strive to be at the leading edge and commit to ongoing innovation. And for those in the audience who have spent a lot of their career time focused on technology, I really thank you for that, because I think timely and accurate data is making a huge difference in jurisdictions, not only throughout the US, but elsewhere. It's helping to inform our reform, our innovation, and keeping us, at the leading edge of policing. So, and I see Shauna on. Hello,
Absolutely.
Assistant
Welcome,
Commissioner.
Shauna.
How are you?
We welcome you to the session, and I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and provide a little bit of background. I don't know if you've gotten the opportunity to listen to some of it. I know you were in watching mode, so you know the conversation we've been having, but I will bring you both up to date, and actually the audience as well. But unfortunately, Erica Shields will not be able to join us because though she had originally intended to be here in person, the storms brought that to an end because she couldn't get on the flight, or the flight couldn't get out. But then even more, I guess she's having storm damage at her home, and she doesn't have internet access. So she was trying, she made all efforts in order to join us. She will be part of what will be future endeavors that we will be having with all of these great resources, but that gives more time for both Shauna and Kathleen to continue the dialogue. So with that in mind, Shauna, could I bother you for a self-intro, a little bit of a background, and then we're going to pose some questions to you to sow some threads with the conversations we've been having with Kathleen.
Thank you. Good morning. I understand it's morning there, so good morning from Ireland. Can everyone hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you. So I just want to start by saying just thank you so much for having me here today. I'm very excited, and what a tremendous honor it is to be here speaking. And I was able to hear some of your talk as well, Kathleen. Your book is on my bedside table. So certainly an area that's very close to my heart. And while I'm coming to you from Ireland, where I'm a Deputy Commissioner, the Deputy Commissioner of Strategy, Governance and Performance with An Garda Síochána, which is the in Ireland here, it's our national police service and national security service as well. But I sound like this because I was born and raised and lived in Canada. And before coming here, I came here in the middle of COVID. That's another story, but I came here right in the heart of COVID to take this position just over 2 years ago. And prior to that, I was in Toronto as a deputy chief of police. And really, I think the reason I'm here today is because in Toronto, I was deeply involved in a reform program that was from the ground up, where we worked with a panel of external experts, some from within policing, many who were not, who had done, enterprise-wide, large-scale transformational change. And after being involved in that and mapping out the vision and the future of that police service, I was involved in implementing a lot of those projects. And I became very interested in what was happening in Ireland because the Commission on the Future of Policing in Ireland was published about 1 year after our report, and they're almost identical. It's so interesting when you look at the two documents side by side, even some of the language, the principles, they're very much grounded in an almost identical vision. And so I found it really inspiring and really appreciated watching the journey that An Garda Síochána was on. And so that's what interested me in coming over here. And I was very fortunate to get this position. So I moved, as I said, in the heart of COVID from Canada to Ireland. And so now I'm working on the project here. And I really love what Kathleen said there at the end around it not being a checkbox exercise, because we're in the final stages of the actual recommendations that were made on by the commission, and now we're actually looking forward and doing some strategic foresight work around, well, what does that mean now? And it really means you have to kind of start from the beginning again and go through the cycle again and continue to co-create with communities to determine what the future of policing is going to continue to evolve and change. And so that's kind of the journey we're on here in Ireland. And so it's a pleasure to meet everyone today, but that's just a little bit about my background. I didn't know how much you wanted me to go into it in terms of depth. So
That's great. Absolutely. We appreciate that. So let me start with a question for both of you that speaks to understanding the difference between what are the culture change issues that are going on here nationally. And we know that to be not only at the state, local levels, the community levels, public sector, private sector, et cetera, and those that are going on internationally. And it goes back to my question and my needing to understand, is the world changing entirely, or is it just the areas that we are focusing on that we need to address? So Shauna, from an Ireland perspective, are they going through the same reform challenges that we are? does their top-down, what I presume to be their top-down management style, allow a more directed and concerted response to it, somewhat like the Toronto and the Canadian model versus, frankly, what we have in the States, which is a lot of independence and 18,000 agencies and 50 different states and probably, no less than, 1,000 different views of the world, and then money's come from different sources. I mean, one I see as potentially coordinated, one I know to be challenging.
I'm glad you started with the easy question. So
Sorry.
what I would say is, no, it's fantastic. Because I think it's fantastic because the issues, they resonate. So they're similar. They're not identical. Some of the technical details are different, but I think that certainly there are challenges. What Ireland has that I think is so special and the world could really look at and learn from is a deep connectedness with communities right across the island in a way that is really embedded in society. And so there is a very high public trust levels for An Garda Síochána. There's some blind spots that exist with that. And I would say when you have a high public trust, sometimes, there's not as much of an urgency to look at some of the issues because they just haven't hit in the same way here. Having said that, it's a very special history. Last year was our centenary, and just a really incredible experience just to be a part of that. And so that the history is a little bit different. It's a large bureaucratic organization because it is a national police service. So I find that it is bureaucratic and difficult to change. It's big. It's a lot of people. It's a big beast. But there is an advantage to being in smaller services. And I say this, having worked in a large city, it's more agile. I could get things done there quicker. I actually think you can strategically change culture quicker in a smaller police service, and you can be more responsive to the needs of communities, which are often very different depending on the communities you're speaking to. I mean, they manifest in similar ways, particularly around socioeconomics and the way that manifests with respect to crime, people who are struggling economically, and that often plays out as well in terms of who has power in society and who doesn't. So, in the US and certainly in Toronto, we would have seen that play out around race lines, in some cases, gender lines. Our LGBTQ community had unique needs. So you can actually tailor some of the responses in a more agile way to serve the unique needs of communities. A little more difficult to do here in Ireland just because it's bigger. But as I said, the history is different. So we also have a very high public trust rate, which is very special and something to be, protected as much as we can. Thank you.
I have several other questions, but I know that with what is this blended session, I don't want to miss the opportunity for the audience to get engaged. Again, if we were all in the same room, I would imagine this more as a town hall. So do we have audience questions? Because Alex will share mics and we'll make sure that everybody hears each other. Again, folks, phenomenal opportunity. Do not miss this opportunity. Okay, so then I'll go ahead with, oh wait, again, whenever I say I'll go ahead, we get that question.
Thanks for giving me an opportunity to kind of ask this because, this first opportunity to kind of come down here and meet a lot of people and hear from different perspective of individuals who are actually in law enforcement. And it's very interesting hearing somebody from another country, going through some of the situations that we are. I think you mentioned that you used to work in Canada before you went to Ireland, right? And you brought up, a good point came up that there are 50 different states in this country. So there's only so much direction that can be coming from DC to these localities that actually matter on a local level. So, but Canada has less provinces than 50. So how much direction did you get from Ottawa, the capital of Canada, while you were working in Canada?
Thank you. So none, because policing is actually run by the provinces. So in the province of Ontario, where I lived, we would have over 120 police services in that one province. So it's very similar to the United States in that your municipality, so the city or the small jurisdiction you're in, is responsible for funding police. But the regulations and the legislations that oversee policing come directly from the province. Each province is different. So even some of the, some of the laws that you'll get with respect to policing, for example, liquor license laws, the age you're allowed to drink at, that kind of thing, will change province to province. So it is actually disjointed in some ways. You have a lot of very small police agencies being, serviced by one province in terms of oversight, accountability of the law itself. Every province is different. The only thing that would really come from Ottawa per se would be our criminal code. So what criminal laws are across Canada are consistent. And then really it's based on judicial precedents. So whatever case law emerges, that would change potentially the code, or Parliament could change the code. But we really didn't get direction on policing in terms of how to do it, what to focus on, what the issues were from Ottawa. They're province specific. And ultimately for me, working in a big city, they were really from the mayor and the boards that had been put together by the city of Toronto.
Other questions? Oh, we got one.
Hi, thank you, Monica Million. I'm from Colorado. What are some things that our two panelists think that institutes like IJIS can partner with IACP and other policing associations to really start help to shift the paradigm in the policing leadership and how we raise up those leaders in our organizations?
Do you want to go ahead, Shauna? I feel like I've monopolized the conversation for the last hour. So.
Oh, okay, sure, yeah, absolutely.
Just taking a break.
I would say that there's a lot of synergies actually, and I would actually say even beyond. Really, if you look internationally, there's a huge appetite in a number of spaces. I've been working on a project with IACP around culture, looking at police culture specifically. I think it doesn't matter what jurisdiction you're in. The strategic levers around that are very similar. And if you look at what's happened in the private sector, I mean, there's a whole science behind this that, didn't exist 20 years ago, that's being used in other places that we could learn from and benefit from. Leadership, I think, is such a great area as well. But what does that mean by leadership? And I really look at that as, how do you make yourself obsolete? So how do you coach, mentor, choose, develop, that whole pipeline from the point that you hire someone, who you hire, how do you make those determinations right through to the end of their cycle in terms of working with the agency that they're in? Like, what are the things that can be done along the way to make things better? And again, there's a lot of data out there on this now. You look at what's happening in the United Kingdom and a lot of the research that's been done there. There's tremendous learnings for us. So I think some of the big areas that feel crunchy, as my CIO used to say, those crunchy spaces, those spaces that are really difficult to deal with. There's so many police agencies around the world that are actually dealing with the same issues. There's a lot of data, a lot of information, and a lot of experience out there that we can leverage. And I think the power of, what we're doing today and the power of organizations like IACP is to bring those experts to the table, but also to workshop these things to really help police leaders to try to grab the nettle and figure out what it is that they need to do. And that's the thing I've found is it's very interesting to see how many police leaders, experienced, well-intentioned, wanting to do the right things, are trying to map some of this stuff out, and yet it's all been well mapped out by others. So bringing that together is really powerful and could make a huge change internationally in terms of what we're doing and why. So.
Kathleen, any thoughts on that? We started to move towards the.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, and I really appreciate the fact that this convening, for instance, just bringing people together and talking about some of this. We work in a business that's so crisis oriented that it's so important to step aside from the day-to-day crises and be more strategic. I talk about being in positions as a police chief or a secretary of public safety where my bosses would have been quite happy if I just responded to each crisis effectively. But I think we really need to step aside and be much more strategic. I think we've come to realize that, but now we need to help facilitate that more. I also think that, I appreciate that I just, attracts a very diverse group of participants. And I think that's really helpful because, again, you get, you're more inclined to think outside the box, when you're engaging with people who represent different perspectives. So I think that's really important. I know I'm working on a project right now with one of my alma maters, the business school at Trinity in Dublin, and it's a leadership and management program for police leaders, where it won't be cops teaching cops. We really want to get people representing different disciplines. We really want to get people, not just academics, but practitioners who have driven change in other organizations. When I was in Seattle, we had great partnerships with Microsoft and Amazon and Starbucks, and they actually invited us to do executive programs or command staff retreats in their environment where they brought in some of their leaders. I mean, we had this incredibly powerful presentation from the CEO of Alaska Airlines, who talked about how they had to completely reinvent their management operation after a horrific crash, and how they went through that crisis, and so much of that was relevant to police leadership. But we tend to stay in our own insular environment. Look, I love IACP. I was on the board of IACP. I was the treasurer of PERF. I mean, I love these organizations, and I remain affiliated with those organizations because I think that's really important, that we have that community of learning, that we learn from each other. But we need to venture beyond, that insular environment, sometimes insular environment as well, and engage with people representing very, very different disciplines. And I don't know whether Shauna heard this very early on, but Shauna, I was even talking about how it's so important to bring people into our organizations that haven't come up through the ranks of policing, because they bring lived experience, educational experience, professional experience that is unique and can really benefit our organizations. So I just think we need to get outside of our bubble, so to speak, sometimes, and learn from others.
That's all great stuff. And I will say, we mentioned yesterday, first of all, there's another question coming, but we mentioned yesterday that as part of the different programs and challenges that IJIS is working on for the horizon, that I've chatted with both of you ladies and SMEs on joining us in what would be the development of this leadership type of program. And again, we don't want to replicate different things that are out there, but we do want to understand what the gaps are and see if we can assist in that process. So stay tuned for that. And I know there's a couple more questions.
Good morning. I'm Tina Bonetta from Aurora, Colorado. Kathy, I was very impressed with your description of how you diversified your command staff in terms of the diversity of where their backgrounds are. And as I'm listening to this, and I'm really connecting with it because 20 years of my life was spent as a civilian leader in a law enforcement organization. And so what I wonder is the future of organizational structure as you diversify, is there space for a paramilitary structure, or do you see an evolution in law enforcement organizations in terms of paramilitary structure that may need to soften or change or otherwise flatten?
I think that's a really good question. And I guess I would say that, I'm all for, but look, people say, what's your management style? Are you an autocrat? Are you more democratic? And I say, I'm situational. In policing, I've had to be situational. Yeah, I've had to make split second, not to sound too dramatic, but I'm being honest. I've had to make split second life or death situations out in the field. And I don't mind making autocratic decisions at a time like that. But if I have even 5 minutes to engage with members of my team or people that I think will, in making a decision, will have a valuable perspective to add as I contemplate my decision, I'll do that. I mean, best case scenario, I'm decisive because I think it's important to be decisive, but I'm also very collaborative and very democratic. And so I think that a lot of those traditional, really rigid paramilitary models need to go. Because I think, and I've also found that, the days of, the people at headquarters sometimes being clueless as to what's really happening out in the field, we really need to listen to people at all levels of our organization. When I was all levels, and that's both sworn and non-sworn. Look, I mean, in the UK, I think at this point, 50%, if not more than 50% of their personnel and their police services are non-sworn. We should definitely move in the direction of having more non-sworn people in our organizations, people who bring different perspectives and different educational experience and different skills to the table. So I mean, that we could have a whole separate discussion just about that. But yeah, so I think the old models, we need to put them in the rearview mirror. And sure, for tactical operations, we need to have structure, we need to have discipline, but you can still do that in a way that that's much more modern and values the input and feedback of others as well, without strictly, a leader, a boss calling the shots and expecting everybody to fall in line.
Great, thank you. I think there's another question coming from the audience.
Bonnie Locke here. Hi, Shauna. Good to see you on screen. Kathleen, enjoyed your presentation. So, you all have wonderful careers, so many successes, but I also feel like we learn a lot if you're willing to share any sort of highlight a lesson learned, regret, mistake, not getting too personal, obviously. And if you're not willing to share it, that's okay too. But I think we benefit from hearing about if you could do something different or change one or two things, what might that be?
We'll
Do you want to go
taking
first,
questions
Shauna?
Sure, yeah, I've got lots. I could do a whole session on this.
Go further
Yeah, me
south
too.
and have the opportunity.
What I would say is, so a couple things. So I'm going to go back to my time in Canada, and a lot of the reform didn't stick, particularly after I left. And it's been, like it hurts, quite frankly. And I think it didn't stick for a number of reasons. One is we didn't engage internally as much. There was an agreement made early on that it would kind of happen in a black box. So we were engaging a lot with community and a lot with the experts on the commission, but we weren't engaging enough with our own people internally. And it created friction that only grew over time because we never got over the hurdle of feeling like it was being done to the organization rather than in collaboration with. It doesn't work in community, it doesn't work internally either. Now, there were some significant things that needed to change. So the idea was to push the organization into some areas where people wouldn't be comfortable. But to go back to what Kathy said about leadership, there were a couple of political crises. We've all lived through COVID and seen what's happened in the policing space. So then they went with a leadership model that was very old school, and it was definitely people who weren't involved in the project. So they didn't feel like they were a part of it. So some of their reform issues were to undo the reform pieces and actually put them out as success. And I was like, wow, this is so strange. It's but there are things we could have done differently and should have done differently. The other thing is around kind of the idea of getting government, whoever your oversight is, whether that's a department or a city or a mayor, whatever that looks like in your world, to really attach them to the reform as well. So it wasn't a whole government approach. It kind of left us on our own to do it. And that also became problematic in the long term. And the last thing that I think, just in terms of my own lesson, moving to another country and moving from one police service to another, I've become a big proponent of, if there's a way to move people around, that's a good thing. And what I would say is, I came here and thought, there's just certain things I assume to be true. And I talk about culture all the time, but I was amazed at how many things I changed my mind about by seeing it done different here. And I thought things that I did not think could be done, and I would have said in Canada, I don't think we could do that, are absolutely possible and should be done. So I found that I grew a lot, and that process of looking in the mirror and really reflecting on your own belief systems, where they came from. How did you accept certain things to be true that are not, I think is just really powerful. And so, what Kathy was saying earlier about going out to multinationals and to people who are outside the policing space and really learning from those outside of policing and learning from those with different lived experience, no matter where they are in community, in the organization, you just have to keep stretching yourself. And I feel like I wasn't doing enough of that before I moved here. So those are just some initial thoughts. And lovely to see you, Bonnie, by the way. Yeah.
Boy, Shauna, you really hit the nail on the head with that one, because I totally agree. I mean, I think we really need to figure out how to sustain the reforms that take place. And I've had a similar, and this is, please, I'll preface this by saying this is I'm not in any way criticizing any of my successors, or, it's very easy to play Monday morning quarterback, but, I look at the enormous progress we made in Seattle, and then sadly, I sat on the sidelines, after leaving there, and watched the department really struggle through all the riots following George Floyd's murder. And, now the violence in the city has increased dramatically. It just breaks my heart, and I'm not saying that, again, I'm not criticizing or judging anybody that's there now, but, I was thinking about how do we sustain like huge progress. Look, we're all going to face, the next crisis is always on the horizon in policing, right? We're all going to face crises from time to time. But how do we have the systems in place? And, it struck me that just a few years after I left Seattle in 2018, so the crisis developed just a few years after that. Yet there's so much turnover now in policing, with chiefs, with command staff, with officers, that all of the people responsible for public order management were new. By the time that the riots following George Floyd's murder occurred. So, to what extent, were those people really prepared or trained? I mean, that's so it's. I think it underscores the point I made earlier that we're never done. It's never done. You have to continue to develop and educate your teams, and we have to come up with a better strategy for sustaining reforms and innovation. And the other lesson that I really learned is that when I went to Seattle, I said, the only way I'm taking this job is if I have the opportunity to put my own team together. Because, I hope this is an example of humility, but I knew that I wasn't going to be able to pull that off on my own. I've, worked in the only way, if I've ever succeeded, it's been because I've had a phenomenal team, and we've succeeded as a team. And, I went to Seattle, and they actually passed a city ordinance that allowed me to bring people in from the outside for the first time in the department's history. And not only was I able, and then I was able to convert some sworn positions to some non-sworn positions. So I learned my lesson that I won't say the hard way, but when I was police commissioner in Boston, I was actually on my command staff. I had, I think, 8 people who had competed against me for the job. And I would say half of them were like, oh, that's great. You got it. You deserved it. We want to be part of the team. And they were great team players, and we worked very collaboratively together. But there were a few who will never be happy, and, really, continued to try to undermine what the rest of us were trying to accomplish. And, I just don't have time for that. I mean, these are really important responsibilities, and we need cohesive teams of people that are going to work together with common purpose. So one lesson that I learned, and I would really encourage all of you to take to heart, is, if you're taking on a big responsibility, really advocate, to be able to select your own team.
Those are great, not only life lessons, organizational lessons, and realities, right? Your reference to the half of them going one way, half of them going another, I'm sure brings different thoughts to all of our minds. So we appreciate that candor. I'm going to ask a question. I don't see any other folks from the audience at the moment that want to ask questions, but For those folks, if you want to just flag Alex down, he'll give you the mic and then we'll know what the lineup is. But talk to us, ladies, if you would, about, I mean, we've chatted about organizational change. We've talked about what are the components of success, whether that's training, whether that's leadership issue or the leadership team, the engagement with the community, your understanding and value of data availability. Talk to us about your experiences in technologies that then, from a cultural or from a change management perspective, are either easily adapted or, if nothing else from the community, are misunderstood and become more problematic for you to either get, implement, or succeed with, right? And I'm thinking of lots of the obvious examples, but either one of you, I'm sure that you've dealt with all these issues. Feel free to jump in.
I'm
The jump in
happy
never
to,
works. Okay, there you go,
okay.
Shauna. Go.
I'm happy to start if you want. So, one of the things I think is really powerful is, open data, particularly aggregate open data that you can share outside of policing across sectors. And I say this because we had a great experience with this back in Toronto where we did it first. So the police agencies came forward and did it first. And then we were partnering with other City of Toronto agencies because a lot of the predeterminants of crime show up in other places first. They show up in housing, they show up in healthcare. And so when you start to see frailties here, you know that 5-10 years from out, you're going to have a crisis, in policing. So I think that that's really effective, and that would be kind of the gold standard. What I would say is it's very interesting being here in Ireland because the systems we have are quite old. And because they're quite old, it's difficult to get good information. Now that's changing. There's a whole program of work in place around that. But the interesting thing is the debate. There's two debates kind of happening here in the country that I've lived through before, and I do think they're wildly misunderstood. One is around facial recognition, the use of AI, particularly around business processing, and in fact, privacy by design. It's always presented as surveillance technology and not. It's really hard to get people to understand that. Okay, that's actually a very small niche area that should be looked at separately and governed separately. But there's this whole body of opportunity here where we can use it, in other ways. And the other one is really around the use of, here in we call it the PPSN number. In Canada, it was your social insurance number, but your number as a unique identifier. That's been done in Europe. I think we're the only country left in Europe that hasn't done it. And it gives really good, accurate information around gender, race, like you name it, in terms of human rights characteristics that you would want to consider in making decisions. So right now we're really in the space of discussing those and really in a political space, having it looked at across the country. Both I think are very well misunderstood, and it's an uphill battle. So those are just sort of some of my initial thoughts.
So I'll just add to that by saying I am passionate about technology as a tool in our business. And I'll tell you a little bit of history behind that. Back in, I took a career break in 1990 when I was serving as a police chief of an organization in Massachusetts, and then decided to take a career break, excuse me, and was offered this phenomenal job at Digital Equipment. And Digital Equipment at that point had 180,000 employees. So Digital and IBM were the two technology companies. Ironically, it doesn't even exist anymore today, but at the time, it was a phenomenal company. And I was responsible for crisis management, executive protection, threats of violence in the workplace, all of this stuff. So I was in a senior corporate security role. And it was just fascinating being in that environment. And this was 1990, like pre-internet as we know it today. And I was able to exchange messages instantly over the digital network with people in other corners of the world. And I said, wow, this is incredible. And, I had come from an office where file cabinets and files were piled high, and suddenly at Digital there was no paper whatsoever. We were keeping everything in electronic files. So it sounds amazing that was less than 30 years, about 30 years ago, but it's just remarkable how far we've come. But I returned to government thinking, wow, I mean, we really need to start considering technology solutions, technology as a tool to enhance the way we do business. So, but I was on the cover, I was a cover girl once, if you can believe it. I didn't have I wasn't a cover girl for, Cosmopolitan or any famous magazine, but I was a cover girl for Government Technology magazine because I was championing a voice data network for first responders because, and again, it's the result of that and similar efforts across the country. We now have the FirstNet network, but just thought that we need to put good tools. I wanted to create the paperless office so police officers out in cars could enter their reports remotely. And sadly, again, we're talking 25, 30 years ago. Sadly, there are too many police organizations that still don't have those technologies. We need to put handheld tools into our cops' hands out in the field so they can do their operations, they enter their reports, enter the data, timely and accurate data in a user-friendly way. And we need to provide secure systems, cloud native systems, whatever, to capture and house this data. So I'm all for that. And we need to have our tech folks like sitting at the table with us, working collaboratively with us to develop these strategies. And one of the biggest challenges we have, and I experienced this over in Ireland, I'm sure you experience it every day, Shauna. I remember when I first arrived over there in 2006, and they were just about to get the Tetra radio system. And I said, wait a minute, I thought Tetra was like outdated technology. And they said, well, guess what? We had to go through a procurement process and it's taken us almost a decade. So it's better than what we had before. So technology is changing so fast that in order to, but yet we're operating in, the Stone Ages when it comes to government procurement systems. So when I wanted to get a new RMS system out in Seattle, I said, we can't go through a 5-year procurement process. This will take forever. How can we do this completely above board, completely legally? We want to be always very conscious of ethic laws and everything. And we found out that we were able to piggyback on a California contract, because Seattle law allowed us to do that. And we were able to, I think we have to figure out how we can modernize our procurement processes so that we're getting and maintaining leading edge technologies. And, we're putting user-friendly tools in the hands of our frontline people because that's what they need and they deserve. So I think that should be a challenge for all of us. Figure out how we can stay at the leading edge, and we're going to have to modernize our procurement processes so that they're still fair and they're still ethical, but they're more efficient.
Each of the examples or the responses that you provided, of course, resonate in a big way with different audience members here. As I'm not sure that either one of you are aware that from an IJIS perspective, actually, we've worked on some procurement issues and guidelines and recommendations in the past, and it is still something that unfortunately has not progressed the way that it needs to from a national perspective, but it still resonates as a priority that we need to address in the future. That said, two things I don't want to let go of. Shauna, we actually did also a facial recognition use case publication. We will send that to you, see if it gives you any ideas for that side of the pond. And being a cover girl on an IT magazine in this group, Kathy, is a good thing, right? That's a big deal. So I didn't want to let that go by either. So questions from the audience? There's another one. There we go, Rick.
Hi, it's Rick Zek, and I've got a question for you. It sort of connects some of the things that you're talking about. Kathleen, you were talking about getting out in the community, building these strong community relationships. Shauna, you mentioned the use of technology, newer things, facial recognition, some new capabilities that might be misunderstood by the broader community. So I would love to get insights from you both on the role in policy around this, the appropriate use policy of technologies, particularly those where there might be a misunderstanding from the community around what they are, how they're used, and what constraints are around them.
Yeah, so hi Rick, how are you? It's nice to see you. So I'm very passionate about good governance around this. I think the lack of good governance on the for-profit side of the house has been challenging, and that's why you have so many people in the AI space now stepping back and saying, actually, maybe we need to take a break and really look at what the technology is doing and reach a point where we're able to get good governance around it. For anyone who's interested, tonight in Ireland, there's actually an RT special happening both here in the UK on this very issue. But I think it's a matter of really working with communities to try to educate them and to allow them to collaborate somewhat in terms of, I mean, because you have to be limited in terms that you can't always do it, but where you can, to look for ways to involve them in the process. One of the things that I really admired that NYPD did is they published their policy on facial recognition and body-worn cameras specifically, and then asked for community input. And they tracked the community input, and they tracked what they accepted, and those pieces that they weren't able to implement, they tracked why. And they kept that up publicly so that people could see it. So that kind of, I actually think there are opportunities here to co-create what this looks like, because we have to be careful that we aren't inadvertently creating new surveillance technologies that kind of move far down the track before the community has really had a say over what that looks like. The other thing, Rick, and I know it's not really part of your question, but one of the things that I think is so important about what Kathy said about handheld technology is you look at how, cars changed the nature of policing, because suddenly, police are coming into a community in a vehicle, windows rolled up. Now there's a separation, a physical separation. I actually think technology has the opportunity at this point in time to break down those barriers, to get us back into communities again, to get us out of vehicles and on foot and on bikes, depending on what the locale looks like. But we are designing actually for the future, and technology is a part of how we will interact with communities. We are actually, whether we mean to or not, we are designing it. And so these are the things I think that we need to think about, and certainly governance and community involvement are really critical. Thank you.
Boy, I really appreciate that, that you mentioned that, Shauna, about publishing policies and encouraging community feedback. I think that's really important. I mean, whether it's a policy around technology and the use of AI, or whether it's a policy around use of force, I really think that the community should have the opportunity to provide feedback and input. And, I think, again, it underscores, it enhances legitimacy, in the process. I definitely think that it's important when considering these different technologies. I often, and I think we need to speak the truth. think we need to be very candid in a respectful way with people. When people recently have talked to me about license plate recognition, I just kind of chuckle and say, well, with all due respect, the horse left the barn about 30 years ago. I mean, I remember being over at the City of London police in the late 1990s and looking at their Ring of Steel, which was their license plate recognition system that they had developed way back then, even before the peace process in Northern Ireland, because they were concerned about, certain players entering, the metropolitan London area. They were able to track every vehicle entering the City of London, and that was in the late 1990s. And I often say to people, okay, so you're concerned about having license plate readers in your jurisdiction, yet you drive along highways every day that are capturing your license plate data for tolling purposes. So I think that, but I'm very, very serious, and I agree with Shauna that we need to have a lot of good governance in place when it comes to these technologies. I actually sat on an AI ethics board at one point, and they were contemplating at that point the issue of facial recognition, and we made a determination and we advised the particular vendor that they should avoid using facial recognition at that point, because the technology wasn't advanced enough, and it could produce bias. The results could produce bias in certain cases, so we advised against using it. So I think it should be a very thoughtful process. But I think that we should continue to engage the community in dialogue so they know the real facts. And again, they're not just responding to slogans, or they're just not, we need to help educate and engage in serious dialogue about these issues, because these tools can be so valuable to us that, and we need to emphasize that and show the community how they can be valuable, not only to the police, but to the community as well.
Okay, we have another question. There you go, Jim.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you. Thanks so much for being part of this discussion, Kathy and Shauna. This is fascinating. Kathy, I'm about 2/3 of the way through your book. I started back in the 90s as the civilian finance director at the Milwaukee Police Department. So I appreciate your comments about the importance and the fact that we're all civilians, whether sworn or non-sworn, and your comments earlier about the diversity in your command staff. But here at IJIS, I'm chairing a working group on person-centric information, and we're trying to figure out how you kind of piece together records on pointing to the same person across different systems, really across different domains, whether it's law enforcement, treatment. And so, Sean, I just wanted to pick up on something you said that was really interesting. You talked about the importance of the national insurance number in some of the countries in Europe. Did I get that right? And how that kind of helps kind of tie one individual together and actually provide you some meaningful demographics. And I looked across the table and I thought, we've got a social security number here in the U.S., but we've kind of, maybe it's cultural, maybe it's revolutionary culture, but we don't want to share our demographics. So even if we have a social security number or even a biometric number, we don't necessarily know race, gender, all of those things. So Kathy, I wanted to ask you, since you've dealt with law enforcement data and tried to do some data-driven things in both here in the States and in Ireland, Northern Ireland, any observations on the differences in data quality? And there's a good discussion about technology before, but I wanted to dig in a little bit about just the quality of the data, regardless of the technology. And are they doing anything better in Europe that we should be doing here? Or?
Well, I think it really depends on the place, to be honest with you. And I think it depends on the place here too. I mean, I know that when we had to completely overhaul our systems in Seattle, when we're moving in the direction of a new RMS system, we had to cleanse all the, because we all know it's junk in, junk out, so we have to cleanse, in many instances, cleanse the old data that we have available to us, and then ensure that the data we're capturing going forward is reliable and accurate. So I think that you really have to be intentional about that, because, and Shauna, not to, again, my perspective on this is dated by a few years, since, I was doing the commission work there. But, my experience in Ireland was, and we actually wrote about this, not only in the commission's report, but in some of my inspectorate reports when I was working over there. The data in many instances was not reliable. It was real, but in a lot of that, it wasn't a technology problem. It was as much a human problem, so we have to ensure that if we're going to put these technology tools into the hands of our officers, that, they are user friendly, that they're intuitive, and that the officers are well trained to use them appropriately, and, so that the information will be accurate. But I recall when we did, for instance, when we were looking at the clergy abuse cases, they were categorized, and some of them were just categorized in, some of them were accurately categorized as sexual abuse cases, and others were categorized in a general category. And and then the Garda had to go back and do this huge exercise to properly recategorize cases. And so it's so important to get it right the first time, because again, if you have bad data, that can be as damaging to a police service as a use of force incident. If you're relying on bad data and you're sharing bad data with your community, that can really undermine your legitimacy as well.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm gonna wrap it up with one more question that I'd like each of you to respond to. We've talked about what are multifaceted challenges, multi-dimensional issues We've spoken about our culture here in the States. We've touched on Toronto. We've touched on the international community. It's all about how do we affect change, right? Whether it's progress, whether we call it reform, whether we call it, challenges that we're trying to address. All of that aside, what do each of you see are the top 2 or 3 or 4 critical success factors to affect change? And whether the change is accepting technology or the change is saying that we need to do things in a more transparent fashion and sort of change the paradigm and engage a more forward-looking theory than what might be traditional policing. What do you see are the top factors that need to be addressed?
After you,
unless-
Shauna.
I was just going to say, go for it.
Sure. So interestingly enough, I was reflecting on this before this session. So I would say there's a few that are obvious, but I'm not going to give you specific issues. Actually, I'm going to say anything you do has to be co-created with community. We talk about putting, people-centric, whatever you want to call it. You're of service to the community, and as community's values change, as crime changes, as the world changes, community has to really be at the center of everything you do. I would say that, and I mentioned this before, it really needs to involve a whole of government approach. If you're really going to make big change in policing, you definitely need support from outside the organization as well as from within. And that goes to my last point, which is like a whole of organization approach, not a checklist. You're talking about organizational redesign, long-term systemic change, which is in a constant cycle. So those are the 3 things, have community at the heart of it and involve as much of government as you can in it so that you get the support that you need, and make sure that it's, it's a whole of service, a whole of organization approach that is continuous. Just high-level thoughts. Thanks.
So, it's not idle thoughts. It looked like you studied for that test, so that was great. So Kathleen, you're not like the pressure is on, but go for it.
And Shauna and I did not collaborate before this, but we're very like-minded because I absolutely believe that, unless the community is engaged, unless that there's legitimacy in the process, that, the police will fail. The police, we go back to the Peelian principles. I know it's, going back to the 1800s can be difficult for some, but it's remarkable how relevant those principles are today. The police are the people and the people are the police, and so I think we really need to have that robust and authentic community engagement. We would not go out and talk to the community and dictate to the community, but engage the community and listen carefully to their perspectives, because it's remarkable, how valuable some of that insight. I've experienced it personally over the course of decades, how it's really shaped, my thinking and my strategies over the years. And by the way, don't lose sight of the value of that same type of engagement with police officers out there on the front lines. I think that's so essential. You can't be, I think in New York City, I first heard the expression, they called the One Police Plaza the Puzzle Palace. Because they were just the cops on the ground felt at that point that they were so disengaged from the real world. And so I think it's really important that police leaders and police command teams are intentional about getting out there and engaging on a regular basis so that they know what their cops are dealing with out there on the front lines. And, finally, I would say it really does come down to leadership. And I've seen it. I've seen how leadership can really impact an organization. And when I say leadership teams can really drive change faster than expected in organizations by modeling, the type of behavior and that type of, democratic and, authentic engagement. People buy into it. And I also think, in terms of leadership, that you need to, you definitely need to chart the course. When I first arrived in Seattle, there were a lot of people who were really bitter about the federal investigation and the consent decree. And, they wanted to wallow in that misery. I just said, fine, I respect that. I understand, you're proud of your organization. This was quite a blow, but you know what? We're pressing the reset button. We're moving forward. We're going to be the finest police service in the nation. And, it's the train or the track. If you can't jump on board, then maybe you should reconsider, your options, because, we need all hands on deck. We just need to really move this organization forward. And it was remarkable how, initially, we got a critical mass on board, and then, you could see it was just so visible. People got really excited about the change and they bought into it, because also we were giving them the equipment, the tools, the technology tools, the training that they deserved, to do their jobs more effectively. So, I think that if you really provide the right environment for the community and for the organization, it's remarkable how quickly things can move in a positive direction.
This is absolutely wonderful. I cannot tell you how much I personally and thoroughly enjoyed this session. I know from the audience engagement and from everybody being focused and listening, they did as well. So I'm very grateful to both of you. I appreciate your making your time. I appreciate you sharing your experiences and providing us your guidance. And I do look forward to engaging you both in opportunities in the future, because we are all of like minds. Our community, the room, the three of us, we are all of like minds that it has to be a holistic approach. It has to be something that we could collaborate on in order to ensure progress. I won't say even success, because there's too many challenges, but at the end of the day, we can affect a difference and make a bit of a change. So thank you so much, ladies. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you very much.
Take care. I'll chat with you both soon.
Thanks
All
very
right,
much.
folks,
Bye-bye.
I hope you